Puppet manipulation is arguably one of the strongest techniques in all of Jujutsu Kaisen, but it's interesting because its information is not as well distributed as some of the other curse techniques that we get to learn more about. So let's go ahead and go over it and all that it can and probably could have done more of in this series so far. But before we begin, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss anime content from me. So puppet manipulation belongs to Kokichi Muta. He is one of the second years at Kyoto Jujutsu High, and his proficiency with the technique is surprisingly impressive. Now, it's important to understand that, like any of the more prominent techniques in the series, this is an innate ability, meaning that he was born with it. But unlike a lot of the things in the series that we have seen so far, this ability came with more baggage, let's say, than some of the others. In particular, it's the reason that he's kind of stuck in one place, always falling apart. This is because the ability essentially forced a heavenly pact on him. Now, it's not made explicitly clear whether he could necessarily have this without the heavenly pact or not, because the idea is that the Heavenly Pact super boosted his technique. So I would assume that even if he didn't have that, this ability would still be very powerful. It's just the insane amount of cursed energy that the pact gave to him is what makes it so effective, giving him not only a near limitless supply of cursed energy, but the ability to use his curse technique at extreme range. That's very important. Most other puppeteers that we see throughout the series are kind of limited in terms of how far away their summons or their puppets can be away from them. Kokichi does not have this weakness, and it kind of forms one of the more interesting aspects of his power. That he can do long-range recon, he can fight multiple battles from far away. It's a significant part. So it's kind of interesting to think that while these things could be separated, it wouldn't work the same way without it. Now, one of the things that isn't fully explained in Jujutsu Kaisen is the prominent difference between puppet manipulation and cursed corpse manipulation. They're kind of alluded to being very similar, and I think at base they are, but the difference is, from the research and all of the tidbits that we've essentially gotten, cursed corpse manipulation does not require a cursed technique to be useful. I mean, it's a learned technique, kind of like barriers. Puppet manipulation is a technique. It's signature to Muta, and he can't really separate that from himself the same way that Ten Shadows is signature to Megami, in the same way that, Straw Doll is signature to Nobara. So this is very much a part of him and his personality and his strategies to fight. Now, in principle, this is one of the more flexible techniques we've ever seen in the series. The principle is that with puppet manipulation, it's specifically referenced that you craft the puppet, but we don't entirely understand what that means, and if it has to have a specific form. It's alluded to by Utahime that the puppets can be in various forms. In particular, she references the fact that what if the puppet was to be an insect, for instance? So we know that they probably don't have to be humanoid, but we do know that you have to have done at least some work to them, and most in particular, the puppet has to have the puppeteer's seal applied to it. What that appears to be is the mark that is on top of the heads of all of the ultimate Mekamarus. This makes sense. It's kind of like his link between the puppet and himself. It works similar to the blood as the medium for blood manipulation. And that's kind of basically it. The extreme cursed energy that he has and can store up is a fact of his Heavenly Pact, and the range of the technique is affected by the Heavenly Pact, but just making inanimate objects that essentially can serve as remote extensions of himself is the thoroughness of the technique. That, of course, does not mean we're done, though, because we have to go over the puppets that we have seen within the series. Now, we have not seen him use a lot of puppets. As a matter of fact, technically, there's only been 3 models of puppets that we have seen, though he had to have had at least one other. The primary form is that we know Ultimate Mekamaru. This is the version that we see at the Sister School Exchange event. It's kind of like a, medium-sized robot, and it has some very decent offense and defensive options. He can use Heat Blast from it, which is where he essentially releases a bunch of, not thoroughly explained, I would assume is actually cursed energy coming out in the form of heat, basically kind of like releasing a giant Iron Man blast. He can actually have a couple variations of this, as he can blast from his hands, as well as merging it with a giant blast from his mouth into Ultimate Mechamaru form Albatross. Now, that is an extremely powerful attack, but it drains a lot of the energy and has a long cooldown time. We also know that Ultimate Mechamaru has a number of close range options, including a sword mode where he uses a lesser version of the Heat Blast to propel the arm forward, while sharpening the fingers into claws and rotating said arm, making it kind of like a drill. We also know that there's a shield attachment to the Mechamaru that basically, in true Jujutsu style, is a shield, but it has a bunch of spikes on it to also make it kind of an offensive weapon. These are kind of the majority of things that we see, but we do also know that because Ultimate Ekamaru essentially is humanoid, it can use any number of tools or items around itself as supplementary material. Now, that is the limitations that we see, but we also know that fairly recently, as it was disclosed in the anime, he can control multiples of these Mechamaru puppets at once. So, while they have some limited but varied options for combat, teaming them up together probably does enhance their combat effectiveness. Next, I think we'd have to talk about Ultimate Mechamaru Mode Absolute. This is the giant robot form, essentially, that basically Mechamaru spent a large portion of his life actually working on. We figure that this model had to have taken at least a couple years to build, and honestly, the payoff for it was pretty much worth it. This thing is colossal, the size of a small building, and it holds the vast majority of cursed energy that Kokichi has stored up over the last few years of his life. He can actually expend this massive reserve of cursed energy to boost his combat effectiveness. He can release it in massive blasts, and this Mechamaru came with the ability to actually store and utilize cursed techniques. Now, these aren't like innate curse techniques. Instead, these are more learnable techniques. We know that he's utilized simple domain in this format. We also know that there's some other variations of this that he has used. He seems to keep these stored in a cylinder. Not entirely sure how that works, but he'll plug them into Ultimate Mechamaru Mode Absolute, and it can project it through the mech itself, either offensively or defensively. We also know that despite the fact it didn't come into a lot of use during its first battle, it does have a pretty prominent communication suite, allowing it to link up with multiple forms of communication had it not been enclosed in a barrier. It also had a pretty powerful suite of monitoring equipment, so he could keep an eye on the surroundings around him. I mean, it seems like this was built to be a much more varied form of Ultimate Mechamaru, as well as being a tank to deliver massive damage upon its deployment. Honestly, I would have loved to have seen more of it, but what we did see of it was really awesome. The only last real model that we see from Mechamaru is the communications device. These are like small circular devices that can be planted. They can be used as a communication system between sorcerers, basically by putting them on somebody's ear. We've also seen him apply these to walls or ceilings to act as surveillance equipment. They're kind of a last-ditch emergency effort that he implements during Shibuya, and that's kind of important because these are not powerful, they're not offensive, they're mostly utility and designed to help the Jujutsu sorcerers deal with the curses. So, not a very powerful last edition, but one that kind of showed that he could have been more varied in how he used his technique. I will also say this, we do have to count the fact that a baseball machine was technically linked to his Mechamaru network, but it wasn't really one of his puppets, so consider that as part of it if you want to. We do also figure there had to have been at least one other model of Mechamaru, because we know that later there were some surveillance images and videos that have popped up, and we know they had been taken with Mechamaru's camera system, and they come from angles and places that the Mechamaru puppet wasn't. So there has to have been an insect modified version or other versions, something similar to the communication device but mobile, that allowed for the capturing of this data and information. And with that, that pretty much wraps up everything we know about puppet manipulation. If you like this video, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe, and let me know if you guys would want this ability. Bye!